He thought the last face he would ever see would be a priest, but instead, he asked for the one person he once ignored. The room fell into a silence, so complete it felt heavier than the concrete walls themselves, as Vincent Moretti sat motionless beneath the sterile white lights, his wrists resting calmly on the cold metal table, the faint hum of electricity in the air the only reminder that time was still moving forward, that in less than 10 minutes, the world he had controlled for decades would continue without him. And yet when the warden asked him for his final request, his voice, steady, unshaken, almost eerily composed, broke through the stillness with a name no one in that room expected to hear. "Bring me Clara Johnson." The guards exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces because this wasn't the name of a lawyer, not a priest, not family, not anyone with status or power, just a maid, just a woman who used to walk quietly through marble halls with her head down and her hands full of cleaning cloths, a woman most people in Vincent's world had never truly seen, and yet here she was, the only person he wanted before everything ended. Outside the chamber, the world buzzed with anticipation, reporters lining the perimeter, cameras poised, whispers traveling like electricity through the crowd as rumors spread about the once untouchable man who now sat waiting in silence. But inside, none of that mattered, because Vincent's thoughts weren't on the empire he built or the deals that made him feared. They were somewhere else entirely, somewhere softer, quieter, buried beneath years of decisions he could never undo. Minutes passed like slow drips of water, each second stretching longer than the last, until finally the heavy door opened with a muted click, and she stepped in. Clara Johnson. She wasn't dressed in anything remarkable, no uniform, no symbol of the life she used to live in his mansion, just a simple coat, worn at the edges, her posture straight, her presence calm in a way that didn't belong in a place like this. And for the first time since he sat down, Vincent lifted his eyes fully, meeting hers through the thick glass that separated them, and something shifted, not in the room, but in him. She didn't rush, didn't speak immediately, just placed her hands gently against the surface, steady, unafraid, her gaze unwavering as if the years between them had never existed, as if the nights she spent cleaning floors beneath the weight of other people's judgments had never happened. And for a moment, the man known for commanding fear in others found himself searching for words, something real, something honest, something he had never needed before. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly, his voice softer than anyone in that building had ever heard it. And Clara's expression didn't change, not cold, not warm, just certain, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. "I didn't come to say goodbye," she replied, her voice calm, measured, carrying a weight that didn't belong to someone the world had dismissed. And as those words settled into the space between them, the air shifted, the silence deepened, and for the first time that day, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if even it needed to see what would happen next. Clara's words did not echo, yet they lingered in the air with a quiet authority that made even the guards outside the glass shift uneasily, as if something unseen had just entered the room, something heavier than the ticking clock on the wall counting down the final minutes. And Vincent felt it too, that subtle shift, that unfamiliar loss of control, because for the first time in years, he was not the one setting the pace of the moment. She was, and she had always been, though he had never noticed. He studied her face more closely now, really looked at her in a way he never had back in the mansion, not when she moved silently through the halls before sunrise, not when she kept her eyes lowered as voices around her grew louder, sharper, dismissive, and not even on the nights when laughter echoed through rooms filled with crystal glasses and tailored suits, when someone would make a careless remark about her presence, reducing her to something less than human, something convenient, and he had stood there, saying nothing, letting the moment pass as if silence were not a choice, but a necessity, as if power did not come with responsibility. "Why now?" Vincent asked, his voice quieter, stripped of its usual edge, because there was no room for pretense here, not anymore, not with the clock pressing forward and the weight of everything unspoken settling between them like dust that had been waiting years to be disturbed. Clara did not answer immediately, and that pause was deliberate, measured, the kind that carried meaning without words, her fingers resting lightly against the glass, steady, grounded, as if she had rehearsed this moment not in her mind, but in her heart, over and over again, until fear no longer had a place in it. "Because you are finally ready to listen," she said, her voice calm, but firm, and something in the way she said it made Vincent's breath catch just slightly, because she was right, and he knew it. He had not listened before, not when it mattered, not when truth was closer than he realized. A faint sound of keys rattling outside the door reminded them both that time had not stopped, that there were still procedures, still people waiting for this moment to conclude, but inside the room, everything felt suspended, stretched thin between what had been and what was about to be revealed. Vincent leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer rigid but searching, as if he were trying to close a distance that had never truly been physical, his eyes scanning her expression for something familiar, something that might anchor him in certainty. But there was none, only calm resolve, only a quiet strength he had once overlooked. "You said you came to save my life," he said, and even now, the words felt strange coming from him. A man who had spent years believing that survival was something he controlled, not something that could be given by someone else, especially not by someone the world had taught him to ignore. Clara's gaze did not waver, and for a moment, the noise of the world beyond those walls faded entirely, replaced by the steady rhythm of something deeper, something that had been building long before this day ever arrived. "What you think happened all those years ago," she said slowly, each word placed with care, "is not the truth you were given." The sentence landed softly, but its weight was undeniable, and Vincent felt it settle somewhere deep within him, a quiet disruption to everything he had accepted, everything he had stopped questioning. And as the seconds continued to slip away, the room grew still again, not with emptiness this time, but with anticipation, because whatever came next would not just change the end of his story, it would redefine everything that came before it. Vincent's mind resisted at first, not out of defiance, but out of habit, because for 12 years he had lived inside a version of truth that had been repeated so often it hardened into something unquestionable, something fixed. And yet the way Clara spoke did not sound like speculation or doubt. It sounded like memory, like something lived and carried in silence for far too long. And that realization alone made his chest feel tighter than the cuffs around his wrists. "You are saying I was wrong," he said slowly, the words careful, almost fragile, as if speaking them too loudly might shatter whatever fragile balance remained in the room. And Clara's eyes softened just slightly, not in pity, but in understanding, because she had expected this, expected the hesitation, the disbelief, the quiet fear that comes when the ground beneath someone's certainty begins to shift. "I am saying you were led to believe something that was never complete," she replied, her tone steady, her voice carrying a quiet weight that did not need force to be felt. And for a moment Vincent closed his eyes, not to escape, but to remember, because memory was the only place left to search now. He saw it again, the mansion bathed in dim light, the echo of footsteps on polished floors, the voices raised in rooms he had trusted. The night everything changed, when the woman he loved became the center of a story he could no longer control, and how quickly everything had moved after that, how quickly decisions were made, statements recorded, alliances shifted, and how he had accepted it all because the evidence had pointed in one direction, because people he trusted had confirmed it, because questioning it would have meant unraveling everything he had built. And he had not been a man who unraveled things. He had been a man who moved forward, always forward. "Clara," he said quietly, opening his eyes again, meeting hers with something closer to vulnerability than he had ever allowed. "You were there that night. And this time it was not a question, it was recognition, the kind that arrives too late, but still demands to be acknowledged." She nodded once, slowly, the movement small but undeniable, and the room seemed to narrow around that single gesture, because it changed everything. It placed her not on the outside of his story, but at its very center. "I was in the laundry room," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective now, as if she were stepping back into that moment with him, allowing him to see it through her eyes. The machines were running, the doors were closed, and most people would not have heard anything over the noise. She paused, just long enough for the image to settle, long enough for him to feel the quiet isolation of that space. The kind of place where people forget you exist. "But I heard a voice. Not hers, not yours," Someone else, speaking low, careful, like they did not want to be recognized. Vincent's breath slowed, his focus sharpening, because this was not something he had been told before, not something that had ever appeared in reports or testimonies, and that absence alone made his pulse steady in a different way, not with fear, but with awakening. Who? He asked, the word barely above a whisper now, because names carried weight, names had consequences, and for the first time in years, he was asking not as a man in power, but as a man searching for truth. Clara held his gaze, unwavering, and when she finally spoke, there was no hesitation left in her voice, only certainty. Marcus, she said, and the name did not echo, but it did not need to, because it landed with a quiet force that seemed to drain the air from the room, leaving behind nothing but the sound of time continuing forward, and the realization that everything Vincent had believed was about to be rewritten. The name did not need to be repeated to carry its weight, because Vincent felt it, settled deep in his chest, heavier than the years he had spent believing in a different version of events, heavier than the silence he had maintained when questions first tried to surface and were quickly buried under loyalty and urgency. And now that silence returned, but it was no longer protective, it was revealing. Marcus, his younger brother, the one who had stood beside him during negotiations, the one who had spoken with calm confidence when everything fell apart, the one who had looked him in the eye and said that the situation had been handled, that there was nothing left to question, and Vincent had believed him, not because the story made perfect sense, but because it was easier than considering the alternative, easier than imagining betrayal from someone who shared his name, his blood, his world. You are certain, Vincent said, though the question sounded more like a reflection than a challenge, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority, carrying something closer to regret, and Clara did not look away, because certainty was the only thing she had carried through all those years, the only thing that had kept her from speaking too soon or walking away entirely. I heard him, she said, her tone unwavering. Not just his voice, but the way he spoke, careful, controlled, like he was giving instructions, not reacting to anything unexpected. And Vincent felt a shift inside him, subtle but undeniable, because that description fit Marcus too well, fit the version of him that existed behind closed doors, the version few people ever noticed, the one Vincent had chosen not to examine too closely. The faint buzz of a distant intercom reminded them both that time was narrowing, that procedures would not wait forever, but neither of them moved, because what was unfolding in that room mattered more than anything happening beyond it. Why did you not come forward? Vincent asked, and this time there was no accusation in his voice, only a need to understand. Because if what she was saying was true, then every year that passed had been built on a silence that could have changed everything. Clara exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of memory, because the answer was not simple. It was layered with moments Vincent had never seen, decisions she had made alone in a world that never gave her the benefit of doubt. Because no one would have listened, she said quietly, and the words landed with a clarity that did not require explanation. Because Vincent knew she was right, knew that back then, in that house, in that world, her voice would have been dismissed before it was even fully heard, her presence tolerated but never valued, her truth inconvenient at best. He lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, because this was not just about what Marcus had done, it was about what he himself had allowed, the spaces he had left open for others to define reality, while he remained focused on control. So why now? He asked again, the repetition softer this time, more personal, because something had changed, something had brought her here after all these years, after all this silence, and Clara's expression shifted just slightly, not with emotion that could be easily named, but with purpose, something anchored, something deliberate. Because I am not the same woman you remember, she said, her voice steady, carrying a quiet strength that had not been there before. And because there is more you need to know than just a name. And as she spoke, her hand moved slowly, reaching into the worn bag at her side, the motion calm, unhurried, as if what she was about to reveal had been waiting for this exact moment, for this exact place. And Vincent's eyes followed the movement instinctively, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense that the truth he had just begun to understand was only the beginning, and that whatever came next would not just challenge his past, it would demand something from him in the present, something he had never been forced to face before, and the room, once again, fell into that same deep silence, the kind that comes just before everything changes. The zipper of the worn bag made a soft, almost fragile sound as Clara opened it, a quiet contrast to the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides, and Vincent found himself holding his breath without realizing it, as if even the smallest movement might disrupt whatever truth was about to surface, because deep down, he understood that this was no longer about suspicion or doubt. This was about proof, something undeniable, something that could not be silenced or ignored the way her words once could have been. Slowly, carefully, she reached inside and pulled out a small, aged metal tin, the kind that might have once held something ordinary, something forgettable, but now carried a presence that felt anything but insignificant, its surface worn, edges softened by time, as if it had been hidden, protected, preserved through years that no one had noticed. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, not in distrust, but in recognition, because something about it stirred a memory, faint at first, like a shadow passing through his mind, until it settled into place with quiet clarity. "That was in the laundry room," he said, more to himself than to her, his voice barely above a whisper, and Clara nodded, confirming what he already knew. "It was always there," she replied, her tone calm, "but no one ever paid attention to it, just like no one ever paid attention to me." The words were not bitter, not accusatory, just true, spoken with a simplicity that made them impossible to deny, and Vincent felt the weight of them settle over him, not as a defense, but as a realization, because she was right. He had never looked closely, never questioned what existed just beyond his immediate concern, never considered that something so important could be hidden in plain sight. She placed the tin gently against the glass between them, her movements deliberate, respectful, as if what it contained deserved care, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out, filled only by the distant echo of footsteps beyond the door and the steady ticking of time that refused to slow down. "What is inside?" Vincent asked. Though the question carried more than curiosity, it carried the quiet hope that whatever answer she gave might shift the course that had already been set in motion, might reach beyond the finality that had been waiting for him just minutes away. Clara's eyes softened just slightly, not with hesitation, but with the understanding of what this moment meant, not just for him, but for everything that had been lost, everything that had been misunderstood. "Something your wife left behind," she said, and the words landed with a quiet force that made Vincent's chest tighten, because Evelyn was not just a memory. She was the center of everything that had gone wrong, the absence that had shaped every decision since, and the idea that she had left something hidden, something meant to be found, changed the air in the room in a way Vincent could not ignore. She knew, Clara continued, her voice steady. She knew something was not right, and she did not trust the people around her, so she trusted the one person no one would ever suspect, the one person who could move through that house without being seen, without being questioned. Vincent looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, the role she had played in his life was no longer invisible, no longer small. It was central, essential, something that had existed all along without his understanding. "Why did you keep it hidden?" he asked quietly, and Clara did not look away. "Because it was not time yet," she answered, her voice calm but firm. "And because revealing it too soon would have put everything at risk, including someone you never even knew you needed to protect." And as those words settled into the space between them, Vincent felt a new question rise, deeper than the others, heavier, something that reached beyond the past and into something he had never considered before. And just as he began to speak, the faint sound of a clock signaling another passing minute cut through the silence, a reminder that time was still moving forward, even as everything else began to stand still. Vincent felt the question forming before he could stop it, rising from a place deeper than logic, deeper than the unraveling truth about Marcus or the hidden past, because what Clara had just said carried a different kind of weight, something personal, something that reached beyond betrayal and into absence, into a space in his life that had remained untouched for years, untouched because he had believed there was nothing left there. "Someone I needed to protect," he repeated slowly, the words unfamiliar in his own voice. And Clara did not interrupt, did not soften the moment, because she understood that some realizations could not be guided, they had to be reached on their own. Vincent leaned closer to the glass, his eyes searching hers now not for answers alone, but for confirmation, for something steady in a moment where everything else felt uncertain. "Clara, what are you telling me?" he asked. And this time there was no distance left between the man he had been and the man he was becoming in that room. Just a quiet urgency, a need to understand before time ran out. Clara's hand rested gently over the tin, her fingers tracing its worn surface for a brief second, as if grounding herself in the years it had taken to arrive here. And when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something softer, but no less certain. "Evelyn did not just leave behind proof," she said. "She left behind a reason to protect it." Vincent's breath caught, subtle but undeniable, because there was only one direction that truth could move now, only one place it could go, and he felt it before she even said it, felt it in the way his chest tightened, in the way his thoughts began to shift, aligning pieces he had never considered connecting before. "She was pregnant," Clara continued, her voice steady, each word placed carefully, deliberately, "and she knew something was coming, something she could not stop, so she made a decision, one that no one else in that house would have understood." The room seemed to fall away for a moment, the walls, the lights, the distant sounds, all fading into something distant and hollow, because Vincent was no longer sitting in that chair. He was somewhere else entirely, back in a time when Evelyn had smiled at him without fear, when the future had felt certain, when the idea of family had not yet been replaced by suspicion and silence. "No," he said quietly, not as denial, but as disbelief, because this was something he had never been told, something that had never been part of the narrative built around her death, and yet it fit. It fit in a way that made everything else begin to shift, begin to lose its certainty. Clara's gaze remained steady, unwavering, not pushing, not forcing, just present, allowing him to reach the understanding on his own. "She trusted me," Clara said, her voice calm, "because I was the only one she believed would not be watched, the only one who could leave that house without anyone asking questions, and the only one who would not see her child as part of the power around her, but as something that deserved a chance to live a different life." Vincent's hands tightened slightly against the table, not in anger, but in something deeper, something closer to realization, because this was no longer just about what had been taken from him. It was about what had been hidden, what had been protected, what had been carried forward without his knowledge. "Where is the child?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, the question fragile in a way he had never allowed himself to be. And Clara did not look away as she answered, because this was the moment everything would change, not just for him, but for the truth that had waited all these years to be seen. "Safe," she said simply, her voice steady. "Alive, and waiting for a father who never knew she existed." And as those words settled into the space between them, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of everything Vincent had lost, everything he had misunderstood, and everything that still had the power to change before time ran out. The word lingered in the air long after Clara spoke it, not because it was loud, but because it carried a truth Vincent had never allowed himself to imagine, a truth that reshaped everything he thought he had lost into something unfinished, something still waiting, and for a moment, he did not move, did not speak, as if even the slightest reaction might cause it to disappear, like a fragile reflection that could vanish if disturbed. A child, his child, not a memory, not a possibility that had been taken from him, but a life that had continued in silence, beyond his reach, beyond his knowledge, and the realization settled slowly, deeply, pressing against every part of him that had once believed his story was already written. "All these years," he said quietly, the words almost lost beneath the weight of his own thoughts. "She has been out there." And Clara nodded, her expression unchanged, not because the moment lacked importance, but because she had carried its weight for so long that it had become something steady within her, something she no longer needed to question. "She has grown," Clara said softly, "without the world you lived in, without the fear that followed your name, and without knowing the truth about where she came from." And Vincent's eyes lowered for a brief second, not in shame, but in recognition of the distance between the life he had built and the life that had been protected from it. The faint sound of a door opening somewhere down the hall reminded them both that time was narrowing again, that the moment they were in could not stretch forever, but inside the room, everything still felt suspended, held in place by something stronger than procedure or expectation. Vincent leaned forward, his posture no longer defined by control, but by something more human, something searching. "Why did you keep her from me?" he asked, and the question was not sharp, not accusatory, but heavy with everything he had just begun to understand. Because this was not just about absence, it was about choice, about a decision Clara had made that shaped 12 years of a life he never knew existed. Clara did not look away, did not hesitate, because this answer had always been clear to her, even when it was difficult. "Because the man you were could not protect her," she said, her voice calm, steady, grounded in truth that did not need to be softened. "And because the world around you would have seen her as something to use, not something to protect." And Vincent felt those words settle into him, not as a wound, but as a realization he could not deny, because he knew she was right, knew that the life he had lived had never made space for innocence, never made room for something untouched by power or expectation. He exhaled slowly, the breath carrying years of silence, years of decisions made without understanding what they would cost. And when he looked up again, his eyes were different, not weaker, but clearer, as if something inside him had finally shifted into place. "What is her name?" he asked, the question simple, but filled with a quiet urgency that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with meaning. And Clara's expression softened just slightly, not with hesitation, but with something closer to warmth, because this was the moment she had waited for, the moment when he would not ask as a man seeking control, but as a father seeking connection. "Isabella," she said gently, and the name settled into the room with a quiet grace that did not need to be repeated, because it carried something undeniable, something real, something that could not be undone. And for the first time in years, Vincent closed his eyes not to remember what he had lost, but to hold on to something he had just found, even as the sound of footsteps drew closer outside the door, even as time continued its steady march forward, because in that moment, everything had already begun to change. The name lingered in Vincent's mind long after Clara spoke it, not fading, not drifting, but settling deeper with each passing second, as if it had always been there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be claimed. And for the first time in years, the man who had built his life on certainty felt something entirely different, something uncertain yet undeniable, something that made the walls around him feel less solid, less final. "Isabella." The sound of footsteps outside the room grew louder now, measured, procedural, a reminder that the world beyond this conversation was still moving forward, still bound by schedules and decisions that did not pause for revelation. And yet inside, time felt distorted, stretched thin between what had been revealed and what had yet to be done. Vincent opened his eyes slowly, his gaze returning to Clara, but this time it carried something new, not just recognition, not just understanding, but purpose, something he had not felt since the moment everything fell apart years ago. "You said there was more," he said quietly, his voice steady but urgent in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with time, because now every second mattered differently, not as an ending, but as an opportunity that could still be reached. Clara nodded, her hand once again resting on the worn metal tin between them, and with a careful motion, she opened it, revealing its contents for the first time. Inside, neatly preserved despite the years, lay a small recording device, its surface aged but intact, and beneath it, a folded letter, the edges slightly worn but protected, as if someone had made sure it would survive whatever time tried to take from it. Vincent's eyes fixed on the items, his breath steady but focused, because this was no longer just about memory or testimony. This was evidence, something tangible, something that could not be dismissed or overlooked. "She recorded it," Clara said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity. "The conversation I heard, the one that was never meant to be known." And Vincent felt a shift in the room, not physical, but real, as if the weight of those years of silence was finally beginning to lift, replaced by something sharper, something clearer. A voice came from outside then, firm but controlled, announcing that time was nearing its limit, that final preparations would begin soon, and the words hung in the air like a boundary, a line that could not be ignored. But Vincent did not move, did not look away from Clara, because what was in front of him mattered more than anything beyond that door. "This can stop it," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "It can," she replied, "but only if you choose to use it, not as the man you were, but as the man you are now." And for a moment, the silence returned, deeper this time, filled with something that could not be undone, because this was not just about proving innocence, it was about what he would do with the truth once it was fully in his hands. Vincent reached forward, his fingers brushing lightly against the glass, mirroring Clara's position, the barrier between them still there, still real, but no longer defining the distance between who they were in that moment. And as the seconds continued to pass, the room grew quieter, not with emptiness, but with anticipation, because what came next would not just determine his fate, it would define the meaning of everything that had led him here. And somewhere beyond the walls, a phone began to ring, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stillness like a signal that something had already begun to change. The ringing did not stop. It cut through the hallway with a sharp persistence that demanded attention, and within seconds the atmosphere outside the room shifted, footsteps quickened, voices lowered but urgent, and Vincent saw it in the reflection of the glass before he even heard the words. Something had changed, something beyond the control of routine or schedule, and for the first time since he had been brought into that place, the process was no longer moving forward with certainty. A guard appeared at the doorway, speaking in a hushed tone to the warden, and though the words were not fully audible, the reaction was unmistakable. A pause, a hesitation, the kind that only happens when a line that was supposed to be final is suddenly questioned. Inside the room, Vincent did not move, his gaze still fixed on Clara, but his expression had shifted, not with hope, not yet, but with awareness, because whatever was unfolding outside was no longer separate from what had just been revealed between them. Clara remained steady, her hand still resting lightly near the tin, her presence unchanged, as if she had already anticipated this moment, as if she had always known that truth, once set into motion, would not remain contained. The door opened again, this time fully, and the warden stepped inside, his posture formal, but his eyes carrying something less certain than before, something that did not belong to a man used to routine. "We have received a call," he said carefully, each word measured, as if choosing them with precision mattered. "There has been a request for immediate review based on new evidence." And the sentence did not need to be finished, because the implication was already clear, already understood, and the room fell into a silence deeper than any before it. Vincent's breath slowed, not with relief, but with focus. Because this was not an ending anymore, it was a threshold, and he understood now that what he did next mattered just as much as what had been revealed. He turned slightly, his eyes lowering for a brief moment, not out of habit, but out of something new, something he had never allowed himself to show, humility. And when he looked back at Clara, there was no distance left in his gaze, no hierarchy, no separation between who he had been and who she had always been. "You carried this alone," he said quietly, the words simple but heavy with everything they now meant, and Clara did not respond with pride or acknowledgement, only with a steady calm that had never needed validation. "It was not about carrying it," she replied softly. "It was about protecting what mattered until it could be seen." And those words settled into the moment with a quiet finality that no one in that room could ignore. The warden spoke again, informing them that proceedings were being paused, that further instructions would follow, but his voice felt distant, secondary, because the real shift had already happened, not in the system, not in the call that had come through, but in the space between two people who had once existed in completely different worlds. Vincent slowly rose to his feet, the movement deliberate, not commanded, not forced, but chosen, and as he stood there, no longer as a man awaiting an end, but as someone who had just been given something he never expected to find, he placed his hand once more against the glass, mirroring Clara's position, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. The room went completely still, and that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like. A powerful story unfolds as a feared mafia boss awaits his final moments and asks to see the one person everyone overlooked. A black maid whose quiet presence once moved unnoticed through a world of wealth and control. Yet what begins as a final request transforms into a revelation that challenges truth, loyalty, and identity. This cinematic journey blends emotional tension with dark romance as hidden secrets surface, exposing betrayal from within and unveiling a past, carefully protected by the very woman society dismissed. Through silence, dignity, and resilience, the Black Maid becomes the keeper of truth, carrying evidence that not only questions the fate of the mafia boss, but reveals a deeper connection that reshapes everything he believed about his life, his loss, and his legacy. As time runs out and the system prepares to move forward, a single moment of courage interrupts the inevitable, bringing justice into a space defined by power and control, where dark romance intertwines with redemption, trust, and the rediscovery of humanity. The emotional depth of this story captures the fragile balance between authority and compassion, where dark romance is not about passion alone, but about the transformation of a man who once ruled without question and the woman who quietly preserved what mattered most. As truths collide and silence breaks, the narrative delivers a compelling experience driven by dark romance, moral awakening, and the enduring strength of dignity in the face of injustice. In a world where appearances define worth, this story reminds us that dark romance can emerge from the most unexpected places, revealing that true power lies not in dominance, but in humility, and that sometimes the one person overlooked holds the key to everything.